Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. This week I talk with Asya Mikhailenko Sturgella, a volunteer with the Minnesota-Ukrainian American Advocacy Committee who immigrated to Minnesota from Kyiv when she was 9 years old. We talk about her family that is still there in a war zone, how she is coping with everything in the news, and the support her community has received on this week's Who the Folk podcast. Asya Mikhailenko Sturgella, welcome to the Who the Folk podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Happy to be here. Hi.
So you were first introduced to me and possibly a lot of people who were watching press conference of you being part of the group that was speaking. It was a group of a couple of volunteers, Ethan Roberts from JCRC, and a group of legislators at the Capitol that spoke about the divestment bill that is going to be working its way through the Minnesota legislature, and we'll have a link to that in the show notes. But part of what struck me was your family story. You yourself are an immigrant to Minnesota. You moved out of Ukraine in 1992, right at the end of the Soviet era. And you still have a lot of family that is there suffering, basically. I'm not sure there's any other way to put it. As this war has started, it is where you're from. It is where you have so much family, including a grandmother. What has this last couple of weeks been like for you, watching from afar all this happening?
It's definitely surreal. And I'm one of the people it made me realize how much I've taken for granted that war doesn't happen in like Europe, in white spaces, just to go there. But certainly just aside from that, just in my homeland. But yet to expand on that, Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. So this is 8 years of conflict when Putin invaded Crimea and the eastern side of Ukraine, the Luhansk and Donetsk regions. And so in some ways, my family's been suffering this whole time, my countrymen. There's a piece of like this legitimacy in the last 2 weeks that I guess has been a gift perhaps of, okay, now the world is watching, now the world is paying attention.
And when it was just Crimea, when it was the Donbass area, I think it was easy to just say, oh, it's a little skirmish. It's not a big deal. But I think if you were paying attention to it, which I know most people were not, in full disclosure, I was only, moderately when it started. And it was sort of out of sight, out of mind for me for the last almost 8 years as a news watcher. But thousands of Ukrainian soldiers have fought and died over that time period. But I think once it turns into this, it sort of is different this time is that it's turned into this full-fledged invasion war where, you have hospitals and apartments and housing being attacked. And, you had talked about very passionately your family, your grandmother, especially who doesn't have the option of being able to leave. She doesn't have the ability to. Can you talk a little more about her and sort of what you've been hearing from your relatives that are still there?
Sure. Yeah. Cause that's just it. My family is here in the States, in the Twin Cities with my parents. And so my relatives in Ukraine, they've come to visit. They have American visas. In theory, right? Like having American relatives is a really good thing, and they should have been leveraging. They knew this was coming. Had a sense. Even 2 months ago, my aunt and I were talking about maybe having my cousin fly out to Minneapolis when some of that intelligence was making it seem like something might come together. And so the kind of the easy answer would be, well, like, why didn't they leave? They should just leave. And there's even been this sense of denial in my head that I've wanted the truth to be different, to say like, oh, you guys have the means to get out of there. Well, the reality is there's grandma. She's not walking on her own. She needs round the clock care. At this point, it's kind of been the perfect storm. And in fact, it was actually my parents that were supposed to be today visiting her because her birthday is this weekend and she's going to be 93.
Wow.
So it was supposed to be a completely different story, a completely different month and experience of us coming to her and maybe seeing her, might be one of the last few times. But instead, she's in her apartment in central Kyiv. My uncle's moved in with his daughter and wife, and they're taking care of her. She's had a health home aide, but at this point, right, like everyone's fending for themselves. And
sure.
So they're really all rallying around her at this point.
And I guess it's it's hard to argue with the people who are fending for themselves.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I mean, as much as I'm sure your uncle would like that home health aide there, I'm sure he also wants them to be safe and away from all of this.
Yeah, I think that was without question when the war broke out was, okay, we got to that was the first thing he did was relocate to be with his mother.
So you've been here, like I said, almost 30 years now. How old were you when you left Ukraine?
9.
Okay. So going back to that beginning, those early years of you being in Minnesota, what was the immigrant experience like for you at that age?
Yeah. So when we came to the Twin Cities, we were part of that wave of immigrants coming through the wave of Jewish refugee status through HIAS that settled in St. Louis Park, and were part of kind of the wave in the 80s and early 90s of kind of all moving to a new immigrant community. And at the time I was starting 4th grade and I got a scholarship at the Jewish day school. Mm. And so that was my experience. And up until that point, I hadn't, our Jewish identity hadn't been explored. My mom is Jewish and my dad is not. And in the Soviet Union, that wasn't really, in the family, we didn't make a point of, right? Like they didn't spend time passing on that identity. So It was in the States when I even it was reflected back to me that, hey, there's this side of you that's Jewish. And so that was a really formative experience as an immigrant, was as part of that Jewish community at the J school.
So you came, and it's interesting because not having explored that side of you before coming to the US, there was no, I was going to say before as you were answering that, at least you had Hebrew as like a common language, a way to communicate, but you didn't have that at all.
No. And it, we would do our prayers in the morning. And it was like the songs were some of the things that came to me sooner, right, than the language, both the Hebrew and the English. So that was a way I found that was kind of an equalizer, and that helped me assimilate. But yeah, I was kind of just learning, and my family was learning with me. So we would, they gifted me a menorah for Hanukkah, and we took it home, and we just kind of were like, I guess these are the instructions. This is we do. We light this thing, and then we just sit there, and there's the dreidel, and oh wait, there's chocolate involved. Awesome.
Right, you're learning all of the important stuff just a few years later than your classmates might have.
Yeah, and we had a host family in Minneapolis that also kind of took us in and had our first Rosh Hashanah with them, and we celebrated Passover, and so they helped instill that also. Okay, tell that story. But so I spent 3 years at the day school where it was really this microcosm. Our graduating class in 6th grade was 10 people, so in some ways that was really a blessing. I was kind of nurtured in this space and went through ESL classes. And by the end of that, I had a good grasp of English and but yet, still a really very conscious of what I had in Ukraine. And during this time, we would go back and forth every 3 to 5 years, again, because my dad's parents were there, his brother.
Right.
And that's really continued over the last 30 years of this very, very vibrant relationship with, we live in Minneapolis, but we also go to Kyiv. And
was it hard at that age to sort of straddle those two identities? And I guess, is it still hard now at times?
At times. And I realized, I think I was young enough where I kind of figured out, right, how to like meld them.
Okay.
And more, I would say, assimilate than really, like, I didn't struggle on a fundamental level, but certainly I always had this overarching feeling of an outsider, or even just like, oh, wow, I'm here part of this, this culture, and there's just this given of like a norm. Mm-hmm. And I always had this sense of like, oh, that's funny, but there's all these other norms, like kind of having this both inside out, I think is a good way to capture how I've felt throughout my life.
Okay. Have you, in talking to other people who sort of came over in similar circumstances, and even if not just Jewish refugees, for refugees for religious reasons, but other immigrants from Ukraine that have come to Minnesota, like, are the experiences similar? Are they different? Are there at least some commonalities that you might have? So there's like some sort of common ground?
I feel fairly unique in how, again, I attribute it to the age at which I came. Okay. That was just like I was young enough to absorb and like identify with the mainstream American culture, mm-hmm. where I've ended up like kind of my social network is really this cobbling of immigrants, just other general transplants, and then Minnesotan born or American born friends and family and associates. Whereas I think a lot of the people, right, I've noticed after you get about 12 or 13, if you were any older, it's that much harder. I've seen like people really maintain their mother culture that much more.
Oh, interesting.
And it kind of somewhere between like 13 and 18, it's sort of on a gradation. My sister was 14 and she's someone that I'll say like most of her friends are Russian speaking or from the former Soviet Union. And most of my friends are American born.
It's an interesting age delineation.
Yeah.
That what that 5 years being so formative to identity looks like.
Yeah. I think about that a lot.
That's really interesting. So one of the ways you had identified yourself in that press conference that I mentioned was as a volunteer on the Minnesota-Ukrainian American Advocacy Committee. And so I guess I was wondering, how active had that organization been, or is it something that is sort of fairly recently formed as a response to what's been happening there?
So the Minnesota-Ukrainian American Advocacy Committee was formed in 2016. And my counterpart, Luda Anastasievsky, has really been the heart and soul of that. She's the chair of the committee now. And what the purpose of that was in reaction to Putin's invasion of Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, to form the relationships with our Minnesota representatives, to advocate for Ukraine, to keep, like I said, right, these 8 years of war kind of front and center, and help make the connections to any legislation that's moving through. And so they've been working at it, so say 6 years.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But there's been this influx just in recent weeks, certainly, of, what else can we do? And in fact, they're trying to get meetings with, at this point, they've covered just in the last few months, even in the lead up to this most recent invasion in January and February, mm-hmm. they had met with Senator Klobuchar and 3 or 4 of the Minnesota representatives.
Okay.
And are working on kind of making the rounds with all of them to help advocate for Ukrainian issues. And so I'm by no means the kind of at the front of that, but trying to do what I can. And the press conference was the opportunity I took to really just tell my story, speak from the heart, just put a little human face on it, and the connection back to Minnesota, that these aren't just people over there that we're all suffering for. Like, there's Minnesota connections. And I think a lot of the time that just makes it much more visceral.
And we'll have a link to the video as well. It's still available on the Minnesota Senate's YouTube page. So we'll have a link to that in the show notes, and people can watch it and watch you. And you and Luda both spoke incredibly passionately and beautifully about just how this bill would be helpful, and how much that what's happening right now impacts you, that even though you're now in Minnesota and have been for quite some time, it still is obviously with your familial connection still there. It could, it's just obviously everything must feel so day to day and even minute to minute for you right now.
It really does. And it's every day. Like, we even have a family chat on WhatsApp going of like, how's it going? What's new? I'm trying to really direct my attention more on that, checking in with specific people more than get lost in that doom scrolling, right? Of just like, whether videos on social media or just through more formal news outlets, while still keeping an eye out and at any given morning or day, like, what transpired? What's happening?
Don't doom scroll. Nothing good comes from that. Not ever. Not over anything.
Well, and then so imagine, like, we're doing that, the Ukrainians are doing that, right? So I'm hearing from my aunt, my uncle, where they're, especially on the times when there's like a curfew, I mean, that's kind of all there is to do. And so now they're taking like intentional measures to go read a book, right? Like, get your mind off of that, because you can't do anything about it in the moment.
Right. Which is probably something that we should all be doing more of like putting the phone down, reading a book, going for a walk. It's warming up here, knock on wood, this week. Like, get away from the phones and the screens, because it doesn't change the reality at all.
Yeah, it's this almost this paradox of, okay, you're really worked up. Great, like, channel that into, contact your representatives, like, do something, or, if you're able to send a donation, whatever it is, that will be helpful. And for years to come, Ukraine will be rebuilding, right? No matter, even if this ends tomorrow.
Right.
And then there's this, like, it's not really helping that for anyone just continually being hooked to the news, glued to that. And I'm getting that feedback more from my relatives when I check in, is they're like, we'll be fine. We're going to get through this. Like, go calm down. Go just take a bath, hang out. Like, they're talking me off the ledge, not the other way around.
The family that's in central Kyiv.
Yes.
Under siege. Is talking you down.
But I think it's for their own, like, mental health too.
I think you're probably right. I think there's something to that.
Us getting catastrophic about it's not really helping them. So something that I was doing, on day 2 of the invasion, and I heard that the Minneapolis skyline was going to be lit up in blue and yellow, and I just started crying. Like, that was such a touching moment, and so validating, that moral support. And like, I just don't think I've ever felt so significant as a Ukrainian walking around in the world. And I had this idea. So, like, I want my relatives and friends to know this is happening, that there's support for them outside the country. And so I started messaging them with any sort of pictures or signs of support that I could find. And that they reacted to really well. And at this point, I think it's like, it even exceeded what I was expecting. It is like such overwhelming and clear support that it's reaching them. I don't have to, I'm not the only one by any means doing that. They're getting it just through mainstream media, but
Sure.
But something like that, those sort of acts have felt more constructive than necessarily just checking in and going, oh my gosh, how are you doing? I'm so worried. It's so awful. By all means, validating that is good. But like I said, it's like, I'm not telling them anything they don't know.
Right. I mean, and that's sort of the thing, right? Is that you want to tell them what's going on, but of course they know what's going on, but it's hard to know what's the right, I've never been in a war zone. What's the right thing to say to somebody who's stuck in a war zone? I don't know.
Yep. That's where I've been at. And it seems like, yes, actually with the more positive, like you're going to get them, we're going to get through this is, seems to be what people are reacting to much more in my experience.
What do you do for yourself? Is it just as simple as going for a walk, picking up a book? Like, what are you doing to sort of I say for fun, but like at the very least, taking your mind off of all of these awful things?
Yeah, I think it's like any sort of self-care, but community is the answer to pretty much anything. Trying to talk about something else. Right. I kind of move between wanting to talk about it and getting my mind off and just getting silly and exchanging funny memes, over text or something that goes a long way.
Yes.
But that's what has been really heartening in this is that feeling of community and support. And like I said, that moral support has been this shining light for me in all of this. And it's the story I'm choosing to really follow is like that faith and humanity piece, because it's so easy to just pay attention to the opposite.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good way to look at it. It is just so, you're right. It's just so easy the glass is half empty.
Yeah.
It's so easy to look at it that way, but trying to find the good moments, the silly moments. And, one of the things that was really interesting to me, which it clearly sounds like you have found solace in this group. I had no idea that the size of the Ukrainian expat community here was quite so large, almost 15,000, around 15,000. I mean, I had no idea. So it's obviously terrible under these circumstances, but it's great that you have found solace in that community as well.
Yeah, I've gotten more active with the Ukrainian community, really centered around the Ukrainian American Community Center in Northeast Minneapolis in the last 5-6 years. Probably again, like since the invasion of Crimea in Eastern Ukraine, that's really been this tipping point for Ukrainian identity, or certainly my Ukrainian identity and my family's, where we've gone from just generally talking about like, oh, we're Russian or we're from Russia. Like that's, for years before that was just easy shorthand to the average American to explain, quickly put into context where we were from. And all of a sudden we've chosen to focus on our distinct identity, much as in Ukraine, Ukrainians have since 2014 switched to speaking Ukrainian, whereas Russian was really commonplace, at least in the central and eastern parts of Ukraine, wearing more like the ethnic, sort of the embroidered peasant shirts, for instance, used to just be maybe on Ukrainian Independence Day. All of a sudden people would start wearing them to work. It just became like this fashion trend that is still kind of hanging on, right? And so it's been a progression as well with, me identifying more with the Ukrainian community here. And what's been heartening in the last 2 weeks is it's right. Like I said, I started more as a member of the Jewish community and really close-knit with that, and then have evolved to the Ukrainian community, and have over the years sort of had to choose, right? Some people knew me as Jewish, others Ukrainian. And here for the first time, like I'm even seeing the Jewish community coming out to support Ukraine. For me personally, it just means a lot. It's one of the first times I haven't had to choose. And like, I feel like I just belong. And that's been really beautiful. And obviously, and much more than the Jewish community, really, everyone seems to, like I saw this beautiful sign, I think out of Paris, that was like, we are all Ukrainian. That touched me deeply.
Well, it has to feel nice to not feel so isolated. I mean, obviously, you and your family here that immigrated is obviously isolated from your family over there. But, in terms of like a global community, it has to feel at least somewhat heartening to know that most, certainly not at all, but most people are supportive of Ukraine and what people like your family there are going through.
Yeah, and I want to comment on also what I said, kind of moving away from a Russian identity, that I by no means am rejecting a Russian identity, or like I think we have to be really careful not to dehumanize the Russian people through this, because that's just going to propagate more of this hate and suffering. And I've got relatives in Russia too, and I've been checking in with them. And there was one of the weekends I pretty much spent looking for ways to try to get one of them out of the country, because I'm under the impression there's definitely going to be this very isolationist period, right? And I'm concerned that for those that stay are going to be suffering for a long time, for maybe decades to come, and that there's this short window right now for people that don't want to subscribe to the Putin regime, that they could leave. And so, for instance, we were trying to get my cousin to Georgia. The Republic of Georgia is one of the few places where currently somebody, where there's an open border from Russia.
Oh, interesting.
But it would have been a 3 days drive from St. Petersburg, and people have been making it, but at present they're sticking around. But so it's not a black and white issue. My heart breaks for them as well. And they in turn are suffering for the Ukrainian people. So it's really unfortunate, right, in this sort of game, kind of in an authoritarian government, where it's the people living under it in some ways are suffering just as much. I certainly, the atrocities, I don't believe that Putin has performed atrocities like shelling and bombing, right, of his own people, but he certainly hasn't shown much concern for them in a lot of ways, in their regard for them.
So going back to the thing you said, which, and I totally agree with you about feeling of empathy and concern for the Russian people, because yes, they're being caught up in something that they don't fully understand because of the propaganda being fed them. But in terms of like identity, in speaking to people for previous articles, it's sort of shorthanded as being, from the FSU, from the former Soviet Union. Right. Are you seeing people now, in part because either of this, or just over a course of time, and maybe it's a generational shift, that people are adopting, sort of in the same way you are, the being from Ukraine or being from Belarus or being from Georgia, as opposed to being from the former Soviet Union? Are they adopting that sort of, country, or nationalistic pride in where they came from?
Yes.
Okay.
Though, it's been 30 years since the Soviet Union.
Right.
We've got a whole generation of people that never even lived in that time.
Right.
So might not even relate, right? It feels a little archaic to now even talk about the former Soviet Union.
That's true. I think that's true, but I think there are people like, I mean, obviously you were, born in the Soviet Union and lived there for 9 years, and your parents for much longer than that. And so I guess it's just sort of which is why I brought up the idea of a generational sort of divide. Like if, I were to ask your parents where they're from, would they say the former Soviet Union? Would they say Ukraine? Would they say like whatever city they're from? Like, and that's why I think there might be a generational aspect to it.
Sure. At this point, they would definitely say Ukraine, and they have for years now.
Okay.
So they definitely, but then if they were talking about their life, they might say, back in the Soviet Union, we would this and that, because most of, their life or half their life was spent there.
Interesting.
And at the time it was the Soviet Union, but in that sort of, when people ask, where are you from? I mean, I struggle with this. I'll give you an example, right? My name's not very typical for the States, Asya. So I'll get that question a lot, like, where's your name from? And it's not distinctly Ukrainian. So I will generally say Russian or Slavic. But right, it gets in this funny zone, which is, I mean, really kind of the other side of this, and what I was talking about, with the Russians, like we really are, for families and tribes of really related people, and just about everyone's got relatives, right? Someone's got relatives in Russia and Belarus and Ukraine, like kind of dispersed all over, as well as other republics. So it's, as a culture, I mean, there is a broader culture that is very much shared, and very much so in the Soviet Union. I mean, gosh, we all, right, like grew up in the same either 5-story or 9-story or 16-story apartment building. Like it was like so cookie cutter. And we,
I've seen the pictures. Like they're very like almost prefab, there's like prefab houses even here in the States where all the houses look alike.
Right.
They looked almost indistinguishable.
Yeah.
Those apartment buildings.
And the way, the curriculum at the school, and the way, like, there's so much we could compare, someone that lived 1,000 miles away. We likely had similar stories.
One of the things I find interesting that you had mentioned when we had talked earlier in the week before recording, and which I find a little bit interesting and sort of shocked me, was that you don't speak Ukrainian, you speak Russian.
That's the other thing. Right.
So there's there's shared culture and there's some shared language, I would imagine, but not totally shared language.
Yeah, right. And then Belarus has a language. Belarusian is its own language that's a bit different, kind of mutually intelligible, but not quite in the way that Ukrainian I can sort of understand, but I can't speak. But whereas my sister, I've noticed she started to adopt a little more, especially here in the last 2 weeks, like really as a point of pride and distinction, where she has shared, she just like acting out the Russian culture just feels wrong to her right now.
Interesting.
But then again, I mean, if I were to call her on the phone right now, we would speak Russian, and same with my parents. But it's I think it's individual, but I think it's been done in a bit of a demonstrative fashion, or it started that way, and it's really taken hold with people switching to Ukrainian.
Okay. That's interesting, but at this point, like, you couldn't just switch to Ukrainian.
So I couldn't, and if I knew the language well enough, I probably would also start doing that, just in that kind of solidarity.
Interesting. That's fascinating. It's one of those things that I just sort of assumed, and wrongly so. But I just sort of, I didn't realize how close and what kind of overlap the language the languages have. It's, I guess, not enough overlap that you could jump from one to the other.
Yeah, if I had spent more years there, I would have likely been fluent in both. And you'll see this a lot where folks, like someone could be speaking Ukrainian and the person responding to them could speak Russian and back and forth, and that's just fine. Like on the news for years has been in Ukrainian, and the reporter will be asking the question in Ukrainian, and whoever they're interviewing, their subject, will respond in Russian, and it's just fine, right? It's not like they have to run subtitles under that. They just assume people understand both.
That's wild. Yeah, things you learn. This is great.
This
is why I love doing these. Yeah. This is awesome. Well, Asya, last couple questions, and we're going to do a complete 180 to borderline nonsense, but certainly a much less intense topic.
Bring it.
What is your favorite Jewish holiday? So
I have two.
Okay.
So I have Purim, because it's just fun, right? That kind of how festive and kind of the dress up and just, I love the story of Esther. Mm-hmm. It's really like a redeeming story. And then my other favorite holiday is Hanukkah. And I've realized it's because it's very accessible. It's something I can do at home. Mm-hmm. I don't have a habit of going to services, and I don't really feel comfortable at temple, but something like a home holiday means a lot to me. And so for years now, I've been lighting the menorah and saying the prayers and connecting to my Jewish identity at that time of year.
Okay. And what is your favorite Jewish food?
Latkes.
Okay.
But I'll eat any sort of fried potato, but especially, grated with some little egg and maybe onion and salt and pepper. That's all you need. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. Fried potatoes are, it's the best.
More. Yeah.
Right.
Enough said.
Well, Asya Mikhailenko Sturgella, thank you so much for joining me. Obviously, best wishes and best of luck to your family that has to be in Kyiv right now. And we are certainly hoping for the best for them and for everyone right now who is dealing with this. But thank you, and thank you to the Ukrainian community here for their strength.
Thank you for the opportunity to tell my family's story. Slava Ukraini.
The Who the Folk podcast is part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network, a product of Jew Folk Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you have suggestions for other podcast guests, please email them to me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. For our other shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast.